The Ukrainians will bring the war in, because Ukraine is in war. So if they join to integration, we will be also part of the war. That's first thing. The second is plus if they join us. It means that all the money what we have and which is necessary to remodernize or modernize and reconstruct the European economy, instead of that would go to Ukraine. We don't support that idea. Thank you very much.
For months, European diplomats had worked tirelessly behind closed doors, pushing forward Ukraine's long and difficult path to join the European Union. Brussels had already recognized the reforms, praised the progress, and prepared to open the first set of negotiation clusters known as fundamentals. These clusters cover the backbone of EU values: democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and good governance. For Ukraine, it was the gateway to full membership. But as the moment approached, one voice broke the unity: Hungary. Prime Minister Viktor Orban announced that his country would not support opening the fundamentals cluster. His argument was clear: Ukraine was not ready, and Europe was rushing into a dangerous decision. He said admitting a country at war would mean importing conflict into the Union. To him, the EU was losing its sense of realism. Inside EU circles, frustration quickly turned to anger. 26 member states had agreed that Ukraine had done enough to proceed. Only Hungary stood in the way. Under the EU's current rules, every member must approve such decisions unanimously. One veto was enough to block the entire process. Orban's move was not new. For years, Hungary had been the outlier on major EU issues, from sanctions on Russia to military aid for Kyiv. Budapest maintained deep economic ties with Moscow and had repeatedly questioned the effectiveness of Western support for Ukraine. Orban positioned himself as the last pragmatic voice in Europe, a leader who refused to follow what he called Brussels' blind loyalty to Washington. Behind the political statements lay other motives. Hungary and Ukraine share a border and a history. In western Ukraine, the Transcarpathia region is home to a Hungarian minority of roughly 150,000 people. Since 2017, Hungary has accused Kyiv of restricting their language rights and eroding their cultural identity. Ukraine, on the other hand, insists that its education and language laws apply equally to all citizens. The dispute has simmered for years, poisoning relations and giving Orban another reason to resist Ukraine's European ambitions. By mid-2025, Hungary made its stance official. It vetoed the opening of the first negotiation cluster, effectively freezing Ukraine's accession process. European officials described the situation as deeply regrettable and politically motivated. Some accused Budapest of using its veto power as leverage, a bargaining chip to extract concessions from Brussels in unrelated budget and funding disputes. For Kyiv, the timing could not have been worse. Ukraine had fought to meet every requirement the EU demanded: judicial reforms, anti-corruption measures, digital transparency, and the alignment of trade laws. The European Commission had publicly stated that there were no objective reasons to block the next stage. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy saw Orban's move as a betrayal, not just of Ukraine, but of Europe's promise to stand united against Russian aggression. In Brussels, diplomats began exploring alternatives. Some floated the idea of changing the EU's decision-making rules to allow qualified majority voting instead of unanimity. That would mean a single member like Hungary could no longer paralyze the process. But such a move would require treaty changes, a slow and politically sensitive path that most countries preferred to avoid. Still, the political cost of inaction was rising. Each month of delay strengthened Russia's narrative that Europe was divided and unwilling to make hard decisions. Moscow's state media celebrated Orban as the voice of reason in Europe, portraying him as a brave leader standing up to Western pressure. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, disappointment turned to defiance. Ukrainian officials declared they would continue implementing reforms regardless of Hungary's veto. They said no political blockade could erase Ukraine's progress or its people's choice to join Europe. Yet inside the EU's corridors, the reality was harsh. Without Hungary's consent, the accession process could not move forward. Diplomats described the atmosphere in meetings as frozen. Every attempt to persuade Budapest failed. Orban remained unmoved, repeating that Hungary would decide when and if Ukraine could take the next step. It was a moment that tested the limits of European unity. The question was no longer whether Ukraine was ready for the EU, but whether the EU was ready to move forward without unanimity. For the first time in years, Brussels faced the prospect of reshaping its own rules just to overcome one country's defiance. And as the debate deepened, Orban seemed to relish his position. Hungary, a small country of 10 million people, had managed to hold the entire European project hostage. The man often criticized as Europe's rebel had once again proven his power, not through strength, but through veto. As one EU official quietly admitted, the decision is simple. Either we change the system, or Ukraine waits for Hungary's permission. And that could take years, weeks past, and frustration across European capitals deepened. The momentum that had once carried Ukraine's EU hopes began to fade. Every meeting of EU ministers ended the same way. 26 countries in favour, one against. Diplomats who once believed Orbán might soften his position now saw no sign of compromise. Inside Hungary, Orbán's message was consistent. He told the Hungarian parliament that Ukraine's membership was not in Hungary's national interest. He argued that Europe should focus on peace, not expansion. According to him, admitting Ukraine, a nation still at war, would bring instability to the Union. He warned that Hungary would not accept what he called Brussels pressure campaigns, or any move that bypassed national sovereignty. In Brussels, the mood hardened. European officials accused Orbán of exploiting the unanimity rule for domestic gain. Some believed he was using his veto to negotiate more EU funding for Hungary, which had been frozen over rule of law disputes. Behind closed doors, several leaders said what many were already thinking. The EU could no longer function if a single member could halt the entire process. Talk of reform grew louder. France, Germany, and several northern states began supporting a proposal to allow qualified majority voting for certain enlargement steps. That change would mean Hungary's opposition alone could no longer stop Ukraine's progress. But even that reform would take time and risk dividing the bloc further. Orbán warned that if the EU changed its rules, it would destroy the very foundation of European unity. In Kiev, the reaction was one of weary determination. Officials continued to implement EU-required reforms, hoping to prove that Hungary's objections were political, not practical. President Zelenskyy insisted that Ukraine's path to Europe was irreversible, even if some leaders tried to slow it. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry called on the EU to find a way around one country's veto, describing Hungary's stance as a gift to the Kremlin. Russia's state media, meanwhile, seized on every delay. Commentators praised Orbán as the only European leader with courage to speak the truth. Moscow used Hungary's defiance as evidence that Western unity was fracturing, broadcasting the message across Eastern Europe. By late 2025, the situation had turned into a political standoff. The EU wanted progress, Hungary wanted guarantees. Budapest demanded that Ukraine change its education and language laws to better protect ethnic minorities in Transcarpathia. Kiev offered dialogue but refused to let the issue be used as a condition for its future. Behind the diplomatic language, the stakes were clear. If Hungary continued to block the process, Ukraine's EU dream could be delayed indefinitely. If Brussels tried to bypass Budapest, it risked tearing apart its own unity. Either path carried consequences. As the year drew to a close, European leaders faced a hard truth. Enlargement, once a symbol of hope and unity, had become a battlefield of politics and national interest. Orbán had turned Hungary's small size into immense leverage. His veto reminded everyone that in the European Union, power doesn't always belong to the largest economies, but to those willing to stand alone. For Ukraine, the wait continues. Its soldiers fight on the front lines, while its diplomats fight in the meeting rooms of Brussels. Each day that passes without progress is another reminder that Europe's promise, while inspiring, remains painfully slow. And for Viktor Orbán, the battle is far from over. To his critics, he is the man dividing Europe at a critical moment. To his supporters, he is the leader defending national sovereignty against an overreaching Brussels. Between those two perceptions lies the uneasy truth that one leader's decision can alter the course of an entire continent's future.